Aliens exist and President Trump knows about it. That's according to Israel's former space security chief. In an interview with an Israeli newspaper, he said the aliens have been waiting until today for humanity to develop and reach a stage where we will understand in general what space and spaceships are. NBC News chief global correspondent Bill Neely explains this one.
Hi, Alison. Well, this is quite a story, and it comes from the man who headed Israel's space security program for nearly 30 years. Chaim Eshed is making the extraordinary claim that the United States and Israel have been in contact with a group of aliens for years. Not immigrants, but extraterrestrials. He has called them the Galactic Federation of Aliens, and he says President Trump is aware of the existence of these aliens and had been on the verge of revealing their secrets, he claims, but was asked not to do so by the Federation in order to prevent what he calls mass hysteria. Well, the retired general says the US and Israel have kept it from the public because, quotes, humanity isn't ready and the aliens don't want to reveal themselves until humanity can evolve, he says, and understand what space really is. Well, the good news is that he claims an agreement has been reached between the US government and the aliens, a contract to do experiments here. There's also, he says, a secret underground base on Mars where there are American and alien representatives. Now, this former head of a branch of Israel's defense ministry is 87. He was very well respected, at least until now. And he said all this in an interview with an Israeli newspaper in Hebrew, but it's really taken off after parts of it were published in English by the Jerusalem Post today. He says he's come forward now in the hope that his news will be accepted as true. He notes that if he'd made these claims 5 years ago, he would have been hospitalized, but now he says, I've got nothing to lose. Well, so far, President Trump has not tweeted about this, though remember a year ago, he did set up the Space Force as the fifth branch of the US Armed Forces. Well, we did ask the White House, the Department of Defense and Israeli officials to comment. So far, they have not responded to the NBC News request, and I wonder if they ever will.
Meet Chaim Eshed. Reports claim he was once the head of Israel's space security program. The man recently gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper. What he said was out of the world, quite literally. He said aliens not only exist, but have also made contact with humanity. That should be great news. I must remind you that we are not making any of this up. These are the words of a man who was the head of Israel's space security program for nearly 30 years. He's retired now and has decided to share a well-kept secret with the world.
Professor Eshed, Chaim Eshed, who is the former head of the Israeli space program, also he's known as the father of the Ofek satellite, he had stated publicly on the Times of Israel's Hebrew version of their paper, the UFOs have asked not to publish that they are here. Humanity is not ready yet. He went on to say Trump was on the verge of exposing them, but the aliens and the Galactic Federation said, wait, let the winds calm down first. They do not want to cause us mass hysteria. They want to make us sane and understanding first. Notice that. They want to make us sane and understanding first. How are they going to make you sane? They have waited until today for humanity to evolve and reach a stage where we will generally understand what space and spaceships are. There is an agreement between the U.S. government and the aliens. There's a lot of countries that have agreements. We know that Eisenhower is the one that kind of started that ball game off, right? Then he goes on, they also signed a contract with us for conducting experiments here. He said that is how accurate they were, the playbook, with what he does know is going to take place around the year 2025. Now, what was alarming, though, and this is, I think, gives some credence to my theory that this may be this may actually be what Professor Eshed is speaking about when they've made a contract to do testing here on the humans, is he said that they have enlisted the military as part of the survivor beta group, who are expected to survive. Starting in 1975, in the early 2000s, the largest beta group not really expected to survive were the homeless, conducted mostly in underground bases out west, New Mexico, California. One of the things that he states is that they were waiting for the winds to calm down. They do not want to cause us mass hysteria. Or a good friend of mine sends me a message regarding that statement right there. He said, while the information is accurate, in other words, what he's saying about the aliens and the all these things that he spoke about, Professor Eshed did, all that is true. He said it's a bit deceitful in the letting the winds calm down first statement. The prevailing belief with supporting evidence is just the opposite. The visitors want to be introduced to the world officially as Samaritans who present gifts to bring peace and heal. He goes, sound familiar?
Last week, I had a story that a Israeli senior scientist who was a former security director in Israel claimed that Israel and the United States had been conversing with extraterrestrials, secret joint agreements, and that they just couldn't say anything about it. But he went public with that. Why? In a moment, Dr. Michael Sala joins us. We'll try to investigate this story next on Coast to Coast AM. Now, this is a bizarre story. This Israeli scientist, former security director out there, claiming that Israel and the United States had a secret agreement. What can you tell us about this guy?
Well, he's a very significant witness because of his status. I mean, he was the head of Israel's spy satellite program, and he began working in that capacity in 1980 at a number of institutions in Israel, and held that position for close to 30 years. And during that time, he got to not only monitor the development of Israel's spy satellites, but also got to cooperate with the U.S. partners who also were working with surveillance satellites. I mean, the Israelis have long had a long-standing relationship with the U.S. intelligence community that has helped Israel get intelligence data on the Middle East. So it's not unusual that the head of an Israeli program with the Israel's Ministry of Defense cooperates with the U.S. But what makes this person very interesting, that's Professor Eshed, is that he has come forward to talk about his direct knowledge of these agreements between the U.S. and extraterrestrial civilizations.
What do you think has compelled him, Michael, to do that?
Well, he's in his 80s. He probably feels that at this point in his life, he's got nothing to lose. I mean, he has achieved incredible status. I mean, he's widely acknowledged as the father of Israel's space program. And he feels that this is probably one way in which he can make a contribution to society, not just for Israel, but for the world at large. And that's a similar motivation that other whistleblowers who have come forward in their 80s or in their 90s, who feel that this is the time for the truth to be spoken, and they do. They come out, they reveal what they were exposed to, and they don't present any hard evidence because that's actually a violation of security laws, but they tell very compelling stories. And because of their status within the military or within a major corporation, I mean, their story is worth listening to. And Professor Eshed's story is very revealing, because when you kind of dig into it, as I've been doing, you find a lot of connections to what has been happening in the United States and what others have said about the U.S. program.
Michael, it's an amazing story. And has anybody had a chance to interview this guy? How did he come forward?
Well, he came forward on December 4th. He gave an interview to this Israeli newspaper called Yedioth, and he answered a bunch of questions, and so that was something that was published. And the very next day, other Israeli newspapers picked up on his interview and looked at the things that he was saying in his interview, and they wrote up follow-up stories. So you had the Jerusalem Post, the Jewish News, the Times of Israel, a number of newspapers talking about his interview and what he said. And, one of the things that people have said who want to debunk the story say, well, he was misquoted, that, there was embellishment of what he said. But, in fact, if you go to the original news source, which is the interview, I mean, it's his words. He's responding directly to questions and answering them directly. So it's all there. It's in Hebrew, and so if you're not a native reader of Hebrew, you can always use Google Translate to kind of get a rough idea of what he was talking about. So there wasn't any misquotation, there wasn't any embellishments. These things that he was talking about, that the U.S. Was working with extraterrestrials, agreements were reached, that there were joint bases on Mars. These are the things that he directly did talk about. So there was no misquotation. So he was actually revealing what he knew from the 30-plus years that he was involved in Israel's intelligence community, either as the head of Israel's spy satellite program, or before that when he was working as an officer for Israel's Ministry of Defense. And what I find very interesting about that period before he became the director of their space program was he was working in the military intelligence on these highly advanced technologies in a very secretive Israeli group called Section 81.
Jeez.
And it deals with kind of like way out there breakthrough technologies. It seems to be a mix of America's Defense Advanced Research Project Agency and the Research and Science, the Science and Technology Directorate for the CIA that work on all of these advanced technologies. So he was working on that kind of stuff before he became the head of Israel's spy satellite program. So he really has an incredible pedigree, decades of direct experience in highly classified technologies and programs, and knows probably better than just about anyone else the sort of programs the U.S. is involved in.
How would you rate, Michael, his credibility?
I mean, it would have to be a 10. I mean, there's no
Oh, my
doubt about
gosh.
it. He is someone that is acknowledged. Even today, the head of Israel's space agency has said that Professor Eshed is someone that he highly respects, that he has been talking about extraterrestrials for decades. And I thought that was really very, very interesting. This is a doctor, or he's actually a general as well, General Isaac Israel. And he was the person who replaced Professor Eshed as the head of Israel's space agency. And he says that during the 30, 40 years that he knew of Dr. Eshed, he said he was always talking about extraterrestrials. And that's kind of like very revealing. it tells us that this is not something that he recently had an epiphany about and, wanted to speculate about life out there. He has been talking about these topics for decades, but of course doing it within the classified world of space reconnaissance, which is where he worked and he headed that program. So it would have only been his peers that heard his opinions on what was going on. But now that he's retired from all official life, he's now speaking directly about this. So, this is not just a one-off thing. So this is a person who knows a lot about extraterrestrial life.
Michael, let's talk more about the specifics as what he has said about the agreements. Then I want to get into some other people who are talking similar things. Well, next hour, we're going to take your phone calls with Dr. Michael Salla as we talk about this incredible story of an Israeli scientist, former head of one of their security departments, claiming that the United States and Israel have had a secret closed-door agreement with extraterrestrials, and they just don't want anybody to know about it. And he's gone public with it. It's an amazing story. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Dr. Michael Salla. We are talking about an Israeli scientist, security director, who has gone public and has said that Israel and the United States have a joint agreement with extraterrestrials. Did he go as far as to say who the extraterrestrials are, what planetary system they may come from, Michael?
No, George, not in the extracts that were published. I mean, in his interview, he might have gone into more detail, but that's in Hebrew, and I haven't been able to translate all of that yet. But he did talk about agreements that were reached with the U.S. and that they involved experiments. And that really brings to mind a lot of the witnesses, the insiders that have talked about secret agreements that were reached that involved experimentation. And one of the insiders that I think is particularly relevant to what Professor Eshed has said is Dan Sherman, who is the author of Above Black, and he said that that he served with the U.S. Air Force from around 1981 to 1993, and he says that he was recruited as a intuitive communicator for the NSA, and he would work out of Fort Meade, communicate with extraterrestrials who would provide data back to him for the NSA on people that were being abducted and experimented on. And he said that once he realized the scope of the people that were being experimented on, how they were being taken, returned, having their memories wiped, and suffering post-traumatic stress, all of those sorts of things, that he decided to leave the program. But nevertheless, I mean, he did say that these were grey extraterrestrials, and so when I look at what Professor Eshed had to say about the agreements and the experiments that were allowed under the agreements, then what comes to mind is that what he's most likely talking about are these grey extraterrestrials that have been part of these secret agreements that go all the way back to the 1950s.
That's truly remarkable. It was one thing to have Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut who walked on the moon, say that we're being visited, that he's been told this. And then when you get another professional like the Israeli security director, it starts to add up, Michael, doesn't it?
Well, that's right. When you get these very credible people who have no interest or no desire to kind of like tell a tall story, but they're just saying these things which actually damage their reputations. I mean, the Israeli professor's been accused of having lost his mind and, kind of like going senile for saying this. But he said, look, I don't care. I mean, I just want to get out there, tell the truth. I've achieved everything that I have in life that I want. I have status, so why not now go out on the public record? And he's absolutely correct. And he and people like Edgar Mitchell and Philip Corso, Colonel Corso, others like William Tompkins, these are people that have reached their 80s, their 90s, and they have nothing to lose by coming out and sharing what they learned while they were working with government, the military, or corporations.
These agreements, were they like signed agreements? Were they handshakes? What do you think they were?
Well, that's always a very interesting question, exactly how are these agreements recorded. As far as I can tell, because of, especially in the 1950s, that there would have had to have been a paper record of this. So I think that there would have been some kind of textual document that both sides would have agreed to, and there would have been some kind of signature or ratification process, and both sides would have been able to keep a record. I mean, that's the normal diplomatic protocol here on planet Earth, and I'm sure that any extraterrestrials would have abided by that. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting in kind of looking at the questions of the agreements was that extraterrestrials viewed the agreements very different to the U.S. policymakers. In other words, for example, one of the terms of the agreements that President Eisenhower agreed to in the 50s was that there would be a strict limitation on the number of people that would be abducted for the alien experiments. But as far as the aliens were concerned, once the agreement was reached, the details as to how many people were taken, that wasn't so important as the principle that they had the go-ahead to take people and experiment on them. So I think President Eisenhower and his policymakers were thinking, maybe they'll take a few dozen people here and there and experiment on them. But in fact, the aliens were taking hundreds of thousands, according to some estimates.
And they still may be doing that.
That's exactly right. And that's because they look at these agreements not so much in terms of the actual details of what is said, but the underlying principles, and take advantage of that, because it's the principle. Once you've agreed that it's okay to take people and experiment on them, and then you just return them unharmed, then it's kind of like, from the alien perspective, it's irrelevant whether you take a dozen or whether you take a million.
Now, in terms of the consensus between the ETs and the humans, why did they think that the human race was not ready or capable to know about this?
Well, that's a very interesting comment that the Professor Eshed had to say. That he talked about the Galactic Federation. He didn't explain exactly who that was, but I would think that it's probably not the Galactic Federation that people often think about in terms of like these human-looking extraterrestrials that look like us.
It's not like Star Trek, right?
That's right. I think he was probably talking about some other federation involving these grey aliens and others that are willing to do experiments on humanity and use them as a kind of commodity.
Laura Eisenhower, related to the late President Dwight Eisenhower, what does she have to do with any of this?
Well, she's very interesting because she says that she was approached to go to Mars as part of a highly classified program, and that she and a friend, along with her two sons, they were targeted by this very secretive group that wanted her to go there and play a particular role on Mars. And after some time, she decided that she was not going to do with that. But what was very interesting was that she was shown a lot of highly classified papers from the Earth Tech Institute in Austin, Texas, and she identified some of these papers later on that were leaked publicly as part of the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program. So she says she saw those documents back around 2010, 2011, as I recall, which was years before these documents were leaked. And she said she was given those documents just to kind of like get her up to speed so that she could learn about the kinds of technologies that were being used on Mars. So that was kind of confirmation that there are these bases on Mars that have been secretly established, and of course, Dr. Eshed said that there are these joint American extraterrestrial bases on Mars.
Now, you've been at this for a long time, Michael. What does your gut tell you about this story?
Well, I think this is really important because this is someone who is taken very, very seriously by the space community. He's a household name throughout the world as far as space research is concerned, and the fact that he is talking about extraterrestrial agreements, joint bases on Mars, that this is something that is going to get the attention of a lot of space professionals who would normally be very, very dismissive of such things. But because of his pedigree, I think they're going to kind of scratch their heads and wonder, well, if he's not crazy, and people say he's not, then is he talking about classified programs? And this is the thing. I mean, there's a lot of very smart professionals out there, and they will always say, well, where's the evidence for this?
Sure.
But at the same time, they understand that when you're talking about classified programs, this is not information that is freely shared. And because Professor Eshed had access to the highest level of classification in the Israeli space community when it comes to space surveillance technologies, that meant that he had access to all kinds of very secretive projects. And so if anyone knows about alien human agreements and joint bases on Mars, it would be someone like the professor. So I think that really is going to be very, very important in the future as more and more people within academia, within the space industry, start paying attention.
Michael, might somebody have told him to go public with this?
Well, that's really the critical question here. Was he just kind of like acting alone on his own initiative in going public? I mean, we do know that he wrote a book, and that when he gave that interview on December 4th, that was published in the Edioth newspaper in Israel. The interview was based, or was supposed to be kind of like discussing things that he wrote about in the book, and so this probably was a project that took a few years, and so it's probably synchronistic that it's happening right now. But I mean, what a time for these kinds of revelations to come forward at this critical moment in American and global history. I mean, we've got the COVID-19, we've got the elections. I mean, our planet is going through, and America in particular is going through really major crises.
Oh, my God. Crazy times. What is the significance, Michael, of the Defense Policy Board?
Well, that's a very interesting body within the Pentagon that typically advises the Secretary of Defense on a variety of programs and policies that should be implemented. They have been historically very closely involved with the Special Operations Command, which is the one of the 10 or 11 now combatant commands in the United States that deals with special operations around the world. So this Defense Policy Board has often been running some of these special operations around the planet. So when you look at the history of that policy board and you look at people who sat on it, like Henry Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, Gary Roughead, the former Chief of Naval Operations, these were all very high-level people, and they are very much aligned with the deep state. Henry Kissinger in particular, I mean, he has a history that goes all the way back to the Second World War. I mean, he was part of the Army's counterintelligence corps. He was in Germany finding German scientists that were going to be brought into the United States under Operation Paperclip. So he knew from the very beginning all about the interest in the flying saucer programs that Germany was pioneering. and subsequently there were agreements that were reached by this policy board or committee called the Majestic 12 Group, and Henry Kissinger was involved with that. So the fact that he, along with Albright, were sitting on this defense policy board was, I thought, very, very interesting, because to me it meant that from the U.S. perspective, who would be running, who would be kind of coordinating with extraterrestrials these agreements? And I think that this Defense Policy Board was probably the entity that was very much involved in it, and Henry Kissinger was a key figure in that. So, so it really does kind of match up with the revelations of Professor Eshed. But of course, Donald Trump sacked 11 members from this policy board and has replaced them, and now he has his own people on the board, and I think that this represents a kind of major change, not only in terms of how the Pentagon is going to run special operations, but also in terms of how the United States liaises or interacts with these extraterrestrials.
I tend to think they came from Zeta Reticuli. What's your guess?
Well, that would be my guess in terms of like extraterrestrials conducting experiments, that these experiments are very likely genetic experiments, and there have been a lot of people, going back to the Betty and Barney Hill case, that point to Zeta Reticuli.
That's a good point. Michael, stay with us. We're going to come back, talk more, and take phone calls with you next. What a story.